Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna wait a little bit for more folks to join, but here's the, I'll start the recording. Cool. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm gonna fill in for Birdrock today and just facilitate going through the doc that I've dropped in. And as new people join, I'll just keep dropping in links into Zoom chat to get to our agenda doc. But that said, folks, feel free to keep adding stuff, but we can get started. I think, Matt, you've got the first topic on here.
Yeah. So just to provide background for those who aren't familiar, so we've been using eirini to run our our LRP workloads, statefulsets for apps. There's this work underway to move to another CRD called the run workload that kind of fills the same niche, just represents it differently. And so as part of that, we have this story that's in flight to take eirini, kind of inline it inside of Karifi and give it a new name, the statefulset-runner. And I think that sounded really straightforward on paper. I think the actually doing it has proven quite a bit more complicated. So like for one thing, there were some issues running the tests. We've mostly gotten through that now. Now there's issues running building the images because we're just building them very differently than we're building in the rest of the Karifi project. It also just occurred to me that while in the main project we just use a K8s client in our tests and in our code to fetch resources, in eirini there's these like auto-generated typed clients that are tied to the LRP type. And so when we actually go and eventually make the change to use the run workload, we're going to have to figure out how to regenerate all those and work with those. And just every step of the process has just proven very difficult, unfortunately, because it's so different from the way we do things in the rest of Karifi. And so this prompted a discussion among the American team last week around, like, are we doing this correctly? Like, should we actually just start over, take the same functionality that we have in eirini and write it from scratch as this new component, but follow the same patterns, use kubebuilder, and just kind of go with the patterns we've established already. So I just wanted to throw that out there, see how the AMER folks felt about that. Just talk about it.
Yeah, I think we should rewrite it. I guess you can do some heavy copy and pasting, but I would take the opportunity because also I think that there are some issues with just the design having been inherited by the old eirini, which was a REST API. So there are some stuff were just moved over for convenience, but I think there are a bunch of abstractions in there that shouldn't be there. They only existed because they used to support a REST-based API. Now they kind of, I mean, they still make sense, but just the whole thing kind of became a lot shallower in a way. Like it used to be REST that goes to creates a CRD. Like it used to be a big. It's never been it's never done a lot, but like it used to be more. Now it does even less. So maybe some abstractions are not needed anymore. I've added a sub item because like just in the last maybe 20 minutes, me and Georgi have been looking at an issue with telepresence because we need to make a change to eirini because we realized it has a bug. Like it's ignoring a couple the memory and disk fields for tasks are being completely ignored. So we're like, okay, how do we run the test? We need telepresence, and we happen to have upgraded our image for our development stations, and we can't install telepresence anymore because the version we were using is deprecated and the new version is completely incompatible. It will take probably forever to figure out how to make it run, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it doesn't feel like it's worth investing time into upgrading to the new telepresence, and in general, just carrying over with all this old stuff. We might as well just redo everything. And until then, I guess we just run the old telepresence. The package doesn't exist anymore. We'll have to build it from source, but we hang in there for a bit longer, basically. And then we just dump the whole thing, like dump all the old stuff.
Yeah, I may be able to help a little bit outside of this meeting with the telepresence. Just was able to get it working for, I think, the eats tests with the modern telepresence, but I did end up with a pair moving all of the integration tests over to use test-env. But that did mean commenting out a fair number of tests that were assuming that like stateful sets are being reconciled to pods and things that don't happen in test-env. But I might be able to offer some of that.
Honestly, like it's just not worth it if we're gonna rewrite it anyway. Like it's just a matter of finding a way of installing the old one. It's just if you use the old install instructions, the packages disappeared. It's deprecated, aka it's been wiped from the face of earth. So now you have, if you want to install it, you have to check out sources and compile it. I hope that we can do that, and then nothing else needs to change. And then we'll go from legacy telepresence to no telepresence at all, because the new telepresence is just very different. It installs stuff on the cluster, sidecars. It feels way too complicated, and the way we were using it was already too complicated. It's like the command is like 15 lines long. It's very complicated. I wouldn't want to touch it, honestly.
So we heard Giuseppe's opinion. Does anyone else have a different opinion about potentially rewriting the eirini controller code as stateful set runner? Anyone object to that?
And we're talking about this here in AMER, and I think our kind of feeling was that it's better to start from scratch, because it also has the added advantage of not copying over stuff that we might not need. So basically simplifying potentially. So just a very natural fit to our strategy of like incrementally delivering value. The other thing, like the big bang, is something that we've been avoiding kind of in the past. So
if we are going to rewrite eirini controller, does it make sense to take the opportunity to use deployments instead of stateful sets?
I guess we're back to the. I think it's the same conversation about dropping some features, I guess, or stopping providing some environment variables or stuff like that. Honestly, like the way I think when we spiked in eirini the this deployments thing, like the changes were minimal, which were just because like it's a pod spec that we really, it's the pod spec we care about. And I think whether it's embedded in a stateful set or in a deployment, it really doesn't make a lot of difference for us, like in terms of like how we generate it. So I think it's a change that we can do whenever we want, if we want to. I think it was like, we literally just grabbed for stateful set, replaced it to deployment, and it kind of works more or less, because the pod spec is identical.
I know there's a mutating webhook that changes the pod so that they have that vcap index set, right?
Yeah, that will break if you start doing deployments, because it's kind of hacked.
Based
it
on
extracts
the
it from the
number
name
in
of the pod
name. Yeah.
So that will break because pods will stop having that number.
Eric and Tim and I have discussed how we might potentially just remove that index entirely and make that work. But we'd have to consider the backwards compatibility implications of that.
Yeah, like you all have explored in the past, so you're aware of like you have to get changes into CLI and everything that's assuming integer-based things.
Yeah, we had a very long thread back in the days, and like we even we tried to see if we could produce numbers as weird as they were, so that we wouldn't have to change everything. And we were like, oh, that weird like 5 or 6 random ID, 5 or 6 characters random ID that Kubernetes generates. What if I turn it into a number using some weird conversion? Can I do that? And I think we realized there was a problem, because sometimes we need to do the other way around. I think we have to go from the number back to the thing. And I think there was an issue with the mapping, so we had to give that one up as well. So yeah, we've thought about this extensively.
I think in terms of like immediate steps though, like going from a stateful set runner to a deployment runner in terms of code isn't that different. Like we just like it even seems like something like the same code base could support both. Like it's like you opt apps into it and stuff. So like I don't think in terms of like rewriting eirini controller, the deployment versus stateful set is like if we just defer that later, that would be a huge issue.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like
Yeah.
in terms of generated resources, they look very similar. It's just in one case it's called deployment, in the other case it's called stateful set. And in one case you can use that hook, in one case you can't, but that's like a different conversation.
Yeah. And like I think for the deployment thing, I think we just need a more targeted like way to wire this in. Like we'll have to like get some changes into the CLI, into cloud controller, etc. Yeah, but anyway, that like I totally agree with where Danny's coming from there. Like as others have pointed out also, like not only are the stateful sets like kind of non-idiomatic, but they also have runtime differences around like placement and restart and stuff, which have caused people headaches. So
yeah, the CF app is a very unique beast. Like it behaves like deployments in a way, but it has more guarantees than deployments, but it has way fewer guarantees than stateful sets. There's just nothing in between. We'd have to write our own thing if we wanted to be like behave exactly the same. We need like our own controller that orchestrates pods, but that feels a bit overkill.
Yeah, right. I think it's I also think as apps migrate themselves to be more Kubernetes native too, they'll probably rely less on like things like a specific instance index and stuff.
Yeah, we should somehow push towards that direction. Like try to, I know, maybe even start saying, if you're relying on these things, well, they're going to be deprecated next version. We're going to break the behavior this way. And kind of trying to nudge people towards a more like, yeah, more Kubernetes native world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good opportunity to get rid of some extra cruft on the eirini CRs as well. Stuff like the organ space is totally, because this came from a place where there was one eirini works namespace and everything got created there. And so if you wanted to see what belonged to an org, you'd have to search by label. So that sort of thing is just redundant now, where things get created in the correct place initially. Yeah, no, so I think we have the CRD, the new CRD is looking pretty nice. We're just copying the implementation over, right? So like we're gonna throw away the eirini CRD. We're not copying it over, are we? Yeah, I was thinking those things end up as labels on pods as well, so they're totally irrelevant as well.
Karifi leaves a bunch of those as nil right now too. So I mean, it seems like if we're leaving a field as nil, it's probably a sign it doesn't have to exist anymore.
Yeah, pretty much everything that is CF specific at that level of abstraction should not. There's no reason to exist.
To be honest, adding CF labels isn't the worst thing. It's probably actually a net positive, because there's like plenty of like third-party like tools like Spotify Backstage and stuff that like aggregate things by label. So like if someone using one of those tools were like, I want to see everything that's in the same like org, like I know they have namespaces, but most of those you just pass it in a label selector and that type of thing works. So like I think even if stuff is redundant, if it's in a label and not in the spec, it's actually not a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, I think at the moment we have it in the spec, at least for tasks, it's full. I think the LRP was cleaned up a little bit, but we didn't have time to clean up the tasks. So I'm looking at the task CRD, it's full of stuff, craft, like the app GUID, that kind of stuff, which doesn't really belong there.
Right.
Also, what do you think about the idea to distribute this reconciler as an optional component, so that if you want to plug your own,
I think it is.
don't deploy the other one.
I'll let Matt talk. Yeah.
That's the idea with these run and build workloads that we're introducing, is that we could eventually get there. I think the thought process is that we'd start with like the default with no alternative. And then once we've got the defaults in place, we can start thinking about how to disable the defaults and deploy alternative implementations that maybe other people write. So I think we're on the same page there. We just might want to start without having to without considering the swap in workflow, and then get to that after we've got it working.
I think the idea was we still ship it in the same code base just for convenience, but you can turn it off. Just because this way you have one repository and we don't have the problems you have now with eirini, but like you have to change
Well,
eirini.
the thing is that we're probably going to put that controller in the same controller's binary, the same monolithic controller binary that our controller deployment runs. So if that's the case.
The way that we structured this for when we did the build workload was we had this kback image builder subcomponent that even though it's in the same repository, we treat it as though it were its own project. So it shares the Go mod file, for example, but it doesn't depend on any other files from the main project.
I see.
And so the idea there is that hopefully we've done a good enough job of isolating it that in the future we could make that a separate repository if we wanted to. It's just a lot more convenient right now to have them all live together so that all the tooling can assume it's there. So
makes sense.
I think we could do the same thing with statefulset-runner and then make that same decision down the road.
Yeah, we could even build separate images for them, and even if they're in the same repository, you can still build separate images for them, and then in either the install instructions or if we have some sort of automated thing, we can turn it off in the YAML. And
that's exactly what we do for kback image builder. So I think we have a pattern to follow there.
That way you don't even pay the price of having it compiled into the binary. Although I don't think the price will be a lot. Like even if we just compiled it into one big binary and turned it off at runtime, I don't think the price would be very high. Like probably be fine. But yeah, if you want to do it super clean, you build it separately.
Cool. I'm gonna do a time check on this topic. I think we're aligned though. Okay, cool. So let's move on. Next one from Giuseppe. Envtest versus kind for repository tests.
Yeah, I guess we've been having this conversation again because the current tests are a bit, a bit weird. Like currently we integrate repositories against envtest, and envtest is not, just doesn't have all the things running that the real system does. And we've partially, I guess, solved this problem by filling in with like fake implementations in tests. Like we have a Go routine that runs and pretends to be the organ space controller or stuff like that, but we still don't have the hooks. It's kind of bad. So we've been trying to do something more extreme. Like what if we try to install all the real, like to run all the real dependencies in those tests all against envtest, but that doesn't seem to be working really well. Like it's kind of complex to gather all the dependencies and run them, etc. I think the natural direction is just run those tests against real clusters, although that makes everything a lot more cumbersome in a way. Like you need some kind running, and it becomes a little bit like the end-to-end flow where like you need to spin up a cluster basically. And I know that locally that is a bit more expensive, etc. But on the other hand, I feel like if we are integrating, we should integrate with the real thing. Otherwise, we're not really integrating. Like at the moment, we're integrating against a fake organ space repository, for example. We're integrating with a thing that doesn't have the hooks. Like it's not the real thing, so it's not integrating. So we should probably try, I don't know, maybe experiment, see how it works, or because the alternative is, I guess, going in the complete different direction. Accept that we don't integrate, accept the risk of not integrating, and at that point, just mock whatever you need to mock, and have like unit tests. At least you don't even pay the price of envtest. I feel like envtest is just a bad compromise. It's expensive as it's almost as expensive as an integration test, but it's also not integrating because it's missing all the things that it needs to have. So I would say we should probably try to go in one of the two directions and settle the thing, because now I think we're not very happy with the tests.
I think it makes sense to experiment. Although I have to admit, I don't share a lot of the concerns that I'm hearing. I think the way I think about it is that we're getting the full integration from the end-to-end tests. So you have confidence that everything's working together properly there. We've tried, and I think we may maybe even have some unit tests for the repositories. We don't have unit tests, but we've tried unit tests in situations where you're using like a K8s client, and those I'm really unhappy with the way those turn out, honestly, because you end up having to stub like the get and the create and all these different methods, and then you have all these type cases inside of there, and like you're not really, all you're really doing is writing a unit test to write a unit test. I don't feel like that actually provides any value, personally. So the thing I like about the test of tests is that you get a pretty high level of realism, I guess, but you're just you have a firm boundary where none of the controllers are working. So you're testing your responsibility as a repository of I'm creating these objects correctly. And then there are cases where you have to simulate the controller to, for example, if you're waiting on a state transition or something. But again, you're kind of just testing that boundary where the repository has this responsibility that when a certain condition happens, it responds this way. And so I personally, I know it's a little confusing at first to understand those Go routines we have that are updating the state, but once you understand the pattern, I don't think it's that bad. But that's just my personal thought, and I'm familiar with it. So maybe coming to a cold,
I guess it's a bit it's a weird boundary. It's not just I'm going to create the CRD and I'm going to be fine. The CRD sometimes will like come back at me with mutations and things have happened, and sometimes there should be a hook or something like that, and it's actually not there. So it's,
yeah, the webhooks are definitely something that we haven't found a good solution for. Like sometimes
it would be nice to,
yeah. Sometimes we have to explicitly set labels that are set for us, and it's messy. I agree with you on that part.
The other thing is,
speaking of the webhooks, it's a little sidetrack, but speaking of the webhooks, I recently looked at those tests, and like it looks like we have a complete duplication of units and envtest tests, because you have for example, a webhook that defaults a value. So you have a unit test where you just call the default method and you check that it mutates the object proper, which is fine. But then you also have the envtest test, which pretty much creates a CRD and checks that it's properly defaulted, which is one and the same thing. So I have created a chore to simply remove the unit test, because I think they're not needed. But that was a small sidetrack, speaking of webhooks.
yeah, we could try. It's just it kind of becomes a lot more complicated. We do not need any telepresence, because you really just need a cluster, and then you can run the controller locally, and the controller talks to the API, so it doesn't really matter what the controller is running. So that's good, but still, you do need like a full-blown cluster. So that's kind of annoying. It becomes it's not a self-contained test anymore. You have to run it with a thing that deploys the cluster, spins it up, blah, 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 just like we do with the end-to-end, which is annoying.
It's actually the initial plan. So basically, we arrived again at this topic because we had the chore to experiment with with kind rather than envtest, but I just wasn't convinced anymore that it's worth. So we tried to pretty much run what we didn't like is actually these simulations, because they're confusing. And like if it's a test saying that my repository creates this resource with these fields, that's fine. And then there are no controllers, I get that, that's fine. But then sometimes we have these simulations, and we just wanted to get rid of them, or maybe not get rid of them, but just run the real controller. But then this would entail pretty much all kinds of creating real secrets, and it just becomes very hairy really quick. And then we realized if we're going to do that, then we pretty much are going to implement the same thing as kind. So we should pick, I guess, a bit on the fence about, I guess that's why we're bringing it up. But I mean, if we are going to rely on the end-to-end tests, on like, because they're providing us with like guarantees that we're integrating and all that, do we even need those env tests then? And can we just go with units? So I guess here is your point about ugly mocking. I guess maybe we can experiment with things there. There was an idea that we can use just the client from envtest and just call the reconciler manually so that we can, we can test error cases and all that. I don't really, we never tried that, but we might experiment with things like this.
It's kind of occurring to me, thinking about this, that like maybe the fact that the env tests are so hard to write is a signal that with maybe, I mean, I think in a lot of cases we don't have any choice because the CF API guaranteed that it would do something that is quite complex. So we're not really supposed to come back from the CF API call until we've got all that stuff done. But in cases where the API shim is doing a complicated dance in order to like make a thing, wait for the thing to finish, and then do this other thing, and like those are the cases that are a little hard to mock. And I guess maybe that ought to be a signal to us that like, well, maybe some of this logic belongs in the controller layer. Like if we could have a controller that would just wait, that would just produce ready state.
The one that comes to mind with that pattern is orgs and spaces, right? And so we do still have that simulation going on in the mtest, but it's much, much simpler than it was before when we were directly interacting with sub namespace anchors. I think now it just waits. We just have something that fakes out the ready condition becoming true, right? Whereas before it was like creating service accounts and doing all this other stuff, right? So, I mean, we have gotten better in that department, but maybe there probably still is room for improvement.
Yeah, I guess we could introduce CRDs that don't match one-to-one with the REST resources that are and do the stuff for us. But then how would you test those? Like, and then because that would then have some logic to wait for something. So you have kind of the same problem because the other controllers wouldn't be running anyway. Like,
yeah, I mean, I think in some cases we just run those other controllers, right?
Yeah, I guess it's easier if it's a matter of running two controllers instead of one, maybe.
Yeah.
Because the way I see it is like, okay, the shim is a layer on top of a cluster with the CRDs and the controllers installed and the webhooks and everything. Like, so it's almost as if like the CRDs plus the hooks plus the controllers, like all that stuff is one interface, and then the shim is an adapter on top of that interface, right? And like mocking that interface is very complicated because there's all these mutations, blah, blah, blah. So we integrate with the whole of it, with the whole of that behavior. Now we integrate with like a very partial / reconstructed version of that behavior. So to me, it's natural to integrate with a real thing for the repository layer, and the real thing in this case is the whole thing. Like, it's just, I think if it were easier to do it, it would be a no-brainer. It's just complicated because you have to spin up the cluster and blah, 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 blah. You can't just run our system like of controllers and hooks and everything easily, locally, and integrate against it, just like you would integrate against a database. Or like, imagine this being Postgres. Like, you could literally spin up the Postgres, and the Postgres maybe has some, how do you call them? Like some stored procedures or whatever. Like, you could just literally spin it up, integrate against it. It will be easy. Like, this is I see this like it's mostly a technical limitation of K8s being very complicated to run locally. Very complicated. Kind is actually fine, but it's still a lot more complicated than just spinning up a process. It's been a day of having these kind of conversations where like there is no clear good way to go. Like everything is compromising a lot. It's been frustrating. But yeah, maybe we should try. I don't know, see how it goes, see how that works out. And if it's terrible, we try in a day of putting up a script or whatever and make targets, see how it goes. And then if we hate it, we throw it away and we wasted a day. It's fine. Also, like try to port over, I don't know, a couple of tests, see how what the difference would be, how much better they look like. Maybe by looking at it, we can convince ourselves that it's either a bad or a good idea.
I agree that it makes sense to try and experiment. I think the only caveat I would throw out there, a concern to keep in mind, is that it's really nice for focused tests like that to be able to run them from the IDE or to run them without the without make. So if in the experiment y'all can find a simple way to like set an environment variable that says like this is the kind cluster I'm using and just run it as go only and not have it all be bash or make file driven, I think that would address a lot of my concerns about going this direction.
Yeah, I mean, do you have issues with the end-to-end tests not allowing you to do that? So like, but like, that means we should probably change the end-to-ends as well then, like,
Yeah.
The end-to-end tests also take like 10 minutes to run. So they're not something they're not my inner loop, they're my outer loop, right? But
yeah, everyone's outer loop, I think.
Yeah.
Like,
Right, but we could change that if we just decouple the deploying to kind with the running of tests. So
which I thought was already the case, but like maybe you don't see it, but like it should be, right?
Deploy env.
Like the script should deploy the kind and then call the tests with some information about the cluster address, right? Like they should not be so coupled that you can't run one without the other, right? I always run the script, so I don't know what's going on under the hood. That's because we have a shell-based development process, but like that should be either already the case or easy to do, no?
Yeah, if you're going through a loop of E2Es, you do the deploy once and then keep on running make test E2E with skip deploy envar set, and then you can just modify it.
Yeah, I think
that's if you're modifying the test code.
My issue is less that it's slow to run. It's more that the only option I found for running it is CLI based, and that's not my normal workflow. So that's all. That's what I'm talking about. Like if we could make it so that these new tests can be driven by Go, as long as you have like the right environment variable set to say like, here's the kind cluster I'm using, and all the scripting does is set up the kind cluster and set that environment variable. I think that
that should be the case already in a way, but maybe we do it the other way around. But like
we might even be able to. I'm sorry if like I derailed this whole conversation, but you might even be able to do this with the end-to-end tests already, and I just haven't tried because it's like my outer loop. So and if we're just doing an experiment, I don't want to throw a big wrench into all this. So maybe forget what I said. Thank you for being open to it though.
It definitely has ways to run on any cluster, because we use the same script to run it against GCP, so GKE and kind. So yeah, you can definitely flip it like that with envars. Just needs to know what they're called.
Right.
Also reuse the same kind cluster. Like if we end up running everything on a kind cluster, we could reuse it, and we could have a prerequisite script that just installs the dependencies once, because that's what you usually need. And then you can, even from an IDE or something, should have a relatively fast thing that pretty much does like run tests on the same cluster, deploy, undeploy, then run some controller somehow. Should be possible.
Yes, I'm looking at the script, and it's kind of possible, but like there is a bunch of steps that the script needs to do, that the script does, that maybe we should move into the Go, so that you don't need the script basically. Like it sets up a bunch of stuff, like it creates an account, it sets up the FQDN, root namespace, all those things, right? So if you skip the script, you don't have those things and they don't work. So maybe that's the problem. We need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, the end-to-ends aren't that painful because I don't run them that often. So I think if it does become super painful for me, I'm happy to write a chore about it. I was just more thinking about like, I think if we have that in mind as we build new testing solutions on top of kind, it'll make this an easier process. But I again feel like I kind of derailed the whole conversation, so I'm happy to yield on this topic.
By the way, we also did a fix last week so that it doesn't keep on crashing the second and third time you run it without recreating the kind cluster. So the registry thing was losing its images somehow, and then KPAC was silently just failing on us. But yeah, anyway, so you can keep on running make test E2E over and over again now, and it's pretty stable, which is nice.
Cool. All right. So it sounds like there's a like chore / experiment to just like try this out on some tests. Does someone want to take the action item to like write that up, make it?
It's in already.
Oh, okay, great.
I deprioritized this chore to like do other experiments, and then this conversation popped up. So I guess we just need to keep trying and bring it up again. I will have more interesting results, or
Cool.
raise a draft or something.
Cool. Alrighty. Well, that sounds good. Let's move on to Ashwin's topic.
Yeah, so I was working out of this chinbox the other day, and I noticed the story about adding validating webhooks to avoid duplicate role bindings, right? And this would be specifically for the kubectl user. And I wasn't too sure about the priority, and I saw that it was sitting fairly on top of the chinbox, right? So to give you a bit of background, so if you're a CF CLI or an API user, and you want to bind a particular user to a particular rule, and if you use the CF CLI or API to do it, we take advantage of the fact that you can't create duplicate Kubernetes resources with the same name. Given that you can't do it, we have this logic in the CF API, which sets the name of the role binding to be the SHA-256 value of the role and the user that you're trying to bind with. And that takes care of making sure, when the CF CLI user is creating a duplicate one, it gets the same name, and then the Kubernetes rejects it, saying that it already exists, right? But for the kubectl user, you don't have to follow the convention, and you can give any arbitrary name on the role binding, and then you end up with this duplicate role binding between the same role and the user, right? So this story is about, hey, let's add a validating webhook that watches the role bindings. And I was a bit concerned about the complexity of implementing this story and then the load it's going to put on our controllers, right? Because when we say we want to add a validating webhook, it's going to reconcile and queue up requests regardless of whether the role binding is related to CF or any other system in the cluster, right? Because we don't make any assumptions about the fact that the cluster is dedicated to running Corify or CF, right? There can be other apps and things that can be there. And then this is going to reconcile on every role binding that's being created. And yeah, I was thinking, hey, do we want to do this now? Does it need to be on top of Chinbox? And maybe, what if we don't implement it and probably pick it up later?
For what it's worth, actually, the Chinbox it's not really ordered by any kind of priority or something. Maybe things are grouped together by topic. We haven't pulled this in any kind of to-do. So I don't know, I don't know if we're going to do it soon. Because you were saying top of Chinbox, like there's no such thing. It's just parked there. So it's otherwise, thanks for your input. Is it the one by Danny? Yes. Validate duplicate roles. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that's good to know. Chinbox isn't prioritized. I don't think we knew that.
Yeah, I don't think we knew that.
Well, it's just like parking place where I mean the prioritized bit is when
Usually when I create a chore, I just drop it in the Chinbox without really caring where it is.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe I think it's good. Like it's good that maybe you just put a comment describing this briefly on this, so that we don't lose this context, I guess. And then we can decide based on this. We can decide to just nick it, or maybe we can find some solution to this. But yeah, that's all I can say, because I didn't really mean to prioritize this thing necessarily in the near future.
Cool. That's good to know. I want to just like agree and elaborate on something Ashwin said, which is just like, as we were like thinking through this one, like we were thinking it was actually pretty risky for role bindings, particularly to put a webhook on them, just because of like the ordering in which things typically get installed, or like a cluster gets set up, such that if that webhook gets applied first, but our like actual webhook's not running or crashing or something, then you are like, you're blocked from being able to like apply any role bindings at all and everything. So that's thinking through some of those things where we were like thinking, uh-oh, maybe this one is more trouble than it's worth. But Ashwin added a comment to the issue and stuff. But
Okay, cool.
it might be a place where like a more dedicated like CF role concept or something actually makes sense, that like shields the core resource or something.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I think it's not the first time where we come to the idea that maybe we need a role thing in front of the actual role binding. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. You're saying there's a comment there, so I guess we'll think about it.
Right. Awesome.
Yeah. I guess the other question I think that came up as we were discussing this is like, is this really a chore? I guess for me, the way I tend to think about it is like, if it touches the end user experience, like it changes functionality, right, for the end user, then it's probably a feature, and we should probably prioritize it in the feature backlog.
Yeah, that actually makes sense to me. I know maybe it's probably a chore because I mean we're just recording ideas with these chores, and I guess we were started introducing these leads concepts and all that, and we did it for a thing or two, and then it started looking more like a chore. But when I think about it, it's actually not. So I think you're correct about this. Yeah, I guess we can promote it to a feature with the context in it, and we can decide if we want to do it, when we want to do it. Maybe we just don't do it. Maybe we come up with a proposal about another user-facing object that will be shielding the actual binding. But I guess we'll have to put more serious thinking in that direction.
Yeah, I added something to our stand-up just to, so for context, at a previous one of these, Giuseppe mentioned chinbox was getting long, and on our side at least, we weren't actually working on them because we didn't pay attention to them. So we've been doing this like Tuesday/Thursday, like more like community pair type thing that looks at any PRs if there are any from outside, or just works through the chinbox. And we've been operating under the assumption that they're like ordered by, I don't know why we thought they were ordered, but we'll tell people to use like their discretion and not just like do something immediately just because it's in there. So
I guess if you want to pick things from there, I mean, yeah, I don't know how we solve this because we split the backlogs. We could potentially arrange for some chores to be in the American to do, or maybe you can just pick some of them that you think is important. And I mean, dropping some lines in Slack so that we know could also work. I mean, it's awesome that you took some time to look into this. I guess we'll have to maybe, yeah, when we had one backlog, it would have been easy because one backlog means everything's prioritized. So you could just pick the next chore and you could ask questions and all that. If you want to collaborate like this, I guess we'll have to put some more thinking into it. But I'm also fine if you pick stuff that you like from the chinbox. The thing is that things might not be fleshed out at all, might be just some vague idea.
Yeah, I think that's just what we'll have to keep in mind and do our own, like put some thought into something. And if it seems ambiguous,
if it's a long description, maybe we thought about this, maybe I thought about it and fleshed it out. But if it's too old, no guarantees there. If it's parked there, no guarantees pretty much. So
yeah, we'd have to introduce another column, basically, like a shared chores thing.
Like a shared chores in priority.
Yeah.
I guess we still need a parking lot where things are pretty much, hanging, waiting to be fleshed out and all that.
Yeah, exactly. So it would have to be an extra column for the prioritized chores, which we can share. if we want to.
Childbox.
Yeah,
Childbox could be.
My feeling is that we should absolutely not do this.
Yeah, I don't think
Like
we
if
need
it's
more
if it
columns in
needs
that
to
back.
be prioritized, then it's probably not a chore, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if it's a chore, then yeah, you should be able to look at the chinbox and pick the thing that pisses you off the most and work on that, right? Like,
Yeah, I think here the problem is more some are not completely fleshed out more than some are more important than others. Like I agree that they don't have a priority in the sense that stories have a priority. They could be still be ordered in. I love to. This is probably more important to be done. Like it's probably good if we do this first, but like it's not.
I guess something that we could do is we could mark the ones that are definitely not fleshed out, or the conversely,
Yeah,
the ones that
exactly.
are ready
Maybe
to pick
label
up,
them.
so that people
just
can
make them
you know,
draft. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can introduce draft label on chores, and then if it's draft, you just don't waste your time on it. If it's not draft, maybe it's worth picking up. About prios, I mean, I don't know, like coming from Tracker a long time ago, everything was kind of nice and ordered, and Banker would like drag things. So that's the priority I'm talking about. As I said, I would be happy for you to pick the thing that you like the most. You think you have context, but I just cannot guarantee that it's in a pickable state. But maybe if I go over them and put drafts on things that are definitely bad, or not fleshed out, maybe then you can just pick up non-draft things.
Yeah, I like the idea of draft because like we don't want to like put so much friction that people don't add things to there. But if you're making a chore and it's just like a title and a little bit, just feel free to put draft on. And also if you have a chore that's like you really want prioritized, I feel like you can just talk to people and get it pulled into normal backlog too. And then the chinbox can be like what Julian and people are saying. It's just pick what suits your fancy that is actually fleshed out.
I mean, as a matter of fact, we still do the interleaved backlog like chore, story chore, or something like that. But that's still that still means that you can pick up things from the chinbox. I usually keep a relatively short horizon on chores because we often change track. Like now it's Concord and something else. It was Vault before, and like it's always like we always have stuff to catch up on. Yeah, I'll definitely have a go through the stuff and stamp them out, the draft ones.
Cool. All right. Well, that was a good discussion. Let's move on to the final thing from Danny, the pod security standards.
And this is just a heads up that we are deprecating pod security policies. With 1.25, they're going to be gone, and they're going to be replaced with pod security standards. The big change is that with pod security policy, you can define security context on pod level, meaning, for example, you can limit the pod so that it cannot run as root and stuff like that. While with pod security standard, the configuration is per namespace. So there are 3 pod security standards: privileged, baseline, and restricted, where restricted is apparently the most restricted. So we are looking into putting those security standards on both the workload namespaces and the namespaces that are running our core pods, controllers, API, and so on. This approach currently has the implication that KPAC pods are not going to be able to start because they don't set security context on their pods. We have raised an issue with KPAC to think about it, dropped some suggestions on ways to approach it, but yeah. Just to let you know that we are looking into this direction.
I guess it also means the responsibility for doing that. It was in eirini, and now it goes totally into Karifi, who's creating the workload namespaces. And eirini or the stateful set controller won't be doing anything at all, apart from creating pods that have got the right settings on them so they comply to the policy.
Cool. Yeah, that all sounds good. Good to know. I linked the KPAC issue you had logged here. Looks like they actually responded fairly recently, but I'm not sure they quite understood. At least reading it, I'm not sure they quite understood that there's an issue with the pod spec that the build pods use, but maybe. Yeah, at least shows that they're like, yeah, we should support restricted, so that's good.
Yeah, eventually they'll figure it out, right? Like as soon as they try and test with 125, their stuff totally doesn't work.
Yeah, I think 123 is the first one that will have this on the correct admission controller by default. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I think 122 you can enable it with a flag or something, but
That sounds right, yeah.
Even 125, if you don't annotate the namespace, nothing happens, right? Even the baseline is not enforced by default.
Yeah, it's just the controller is active. Well, inside the API by
yeah, right.
It's turned on to look at the labels.
So it's very plausible that they would just go through the radars until some user tries to do this and it blows up.
If you look at a cluster with Karifi and all its dependencies installed, the only pod security policies are the two that eirini set up. So I doubt if any of the other components are actually thinking about it at all. So it won't affect their testing really. Probably.
Yeah, there might be like as soon as this thing becomes widespread and people start annotating their namespaces, there might be like a storm of issues for like all these projects that suddenly realize they've been running in very insecure configurations. So it's definitely a change in the good direction. You can just annotate a namespace and have guarantee that all pods in there are running to a level of security that you at least understand. So, and it's been set by someone who knows what they're doing, because writing your own PSPs was a nightmare.
Cool. Well, unless anyone has anything else to add to this doc or just a talk in general, I think that's it. I think we've another successful CF on K8s working group meeting. So
I'm just letting you know that I moved that story about the webhooks to the inbox, and it's no longer a chore. Put some comment on it, so you can.
Cool. Thank you. All right, well, I think that's it then. I will see everybody later.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.